Welcome to the Mental Health Multiverse.
We're your hosts, HB and LB. If you're also on a healing journey and enjoy pop culture, stick around.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Mental Health Multiverse. I am HB, joined here with my co-host LB, but we also have a couple of very special guests joining us on the podcast today. But before we get to introducing them, I'll let you know what we are talking to them about. Our season is all about breaking down Disney villains and Pixar villains that we have not yet talked about on our podcast. And we thought it would be really fun to do an episode just focusing on what makes a villain, what makes a good villain, what makes a bad villain. I guess a bad villain would be a good villain, maybe, if we, I don't know. But I think you know what I'm trying to say. Like, what makes a villain that's not very good at being a villain, right? And so without further ado, LB, why don't you introduce our guests?
Yay! Yes, I'm so excited. Today we are joined by Julia, Rago and Becca Majors, who are in real life friends, but also they have an amazing podcast of their own, which is why they are here today, or why I asked them to be here today. They are the hosts of the incredible Star Wars Fan Cast podcast, and that's kind of how we like reignited our friendship, is talking about Star Wars, and it's really, really cool. So anyway, Julia, say hello to the people, and Becca,
hi,
say hello.
Super happy to be here. Like they said, I'm Julia. This is Becca. We are best friends. We're lifelong Star Wars fans. We host a Star Wars narrative analysis podcast. Like they said, it's called The Good, the Bad, and the Batch. We talk a lot about, obviously, narrative analysis, but in that characters, and obviously in the realm of Star Wars, it has a lot to do with villains. We've spent like 3 seasons talking about the show The Bad Batch, which has some really incredible villains in it. And we love to just sort of like get into the weeds and like talk about
quite
like
a bevy of them, I would
say. Like what makes them who they are. Honestly,
Yeah.
I think it's like something I really enjoy about our podcast is just getting to chat about like character archetypes and like how they work and stuff. And, you know, when we were watching a show episode to episode, it was like, oh, I wonder where they're going. And we're having a lot of fun predicting that. Not always right, definitely usually wrong.
Not
but
always right.
I'd like to say that we learned a lot about characters in that.
You can learn a lot from your failures.
Yeah, absolutely, is what I like to say.
Yeah. So thank you so much for being here. Like you mentioned in your podcast, which is narrative analysis, which I love. I love the way that you guys talk about villains, and specifically the one that comes to mind is Charlie Rampart. That's on his first name, but that's okay. It's kind of like an inside joke with
him.
Yeah, exactly. But I just really love the way you guys break down, like, especially motive and potential redemption arcs and I don't know, all of these things that I think we kind of gravitate toward when looking at or talking about villains. And also specifically with Star Wars, I do like how the villains aren't as black and white, right? Like in Disney and in Pixar movies, it's very much like this is the bad guy and they do some bad shit. But I also really like the more nuanced villains of like, they kind of suck and they have bad motivations, but like you can kind of understand why. And that's something that we are talking about a little bit when we're exploring the villains, is, you know, their background and motivation, what traumas they may have experienced, and then how that plays into their relationships now, how they cope, and if there is any potential for redemption, and if not, like what could have been done differently.
We talk a lot about what could have been done differently.
Oh, yeah. We have a lot of opinions on that.
Yeah, and I agree with a bunch of them. I'll just say that.
I cannot yet listen to your podcast because I have never watched The Bad Batch. So I am a little out of the loop.
It's all good. It's a pretty, the great thing about that show is that like, while it is connected to like other Star Wars properties, it does stand like pretty well on its own. So like, you know, this character who we lovingly call Charlie Rampart, his name is not Charlie. It was revealed way later that he has a different first name. We just came up with one for him because we were tired of calling him his last name. But yeah, honestly, it's a great show. I super recommend it. But he is definitely like a really interesting villain, I think, to analyze and get into the weeds.
Yeah, I think it's interesting the way that he's placed within like the Star Wars hierarchy, or at least the Imperial hierarchy, where like he's kind of like, you could transpose him from like Star Wars into like a really toxic corporate environment and he would be the same person, like maybe minus some murder, but like, I mean, maybe not.
Depends the environment.
But like, you know, in a world like Star Wars where you have the Sith and you have these magical abilities and the Jedi, and it's also like kind of woo-woo a little bit sometimes, you also have people who are just greedy and want power. So I think that's one of the reasons why we thought he was a really interesting villain in that context.
Yeah, for sure. So speaking of interesting villains, I guess my first question to y'all, to kind of open the floor to you, is what makes a good villain, which is, you know, the topic of this episode. And do you have any like quote unquote favorite villains or anything?
It's so hard. I feel like with everything, and I think I've just like kind of realized this podcasting at this point is just like it's so much easier to be like, I have so many examples of really bad villains.
It's so much easier to talk
Like,
about like shitty villains
like,
or
yeah.
shitty characters. Yeah.
Star Wars too. Like, I mean, everyone has their like opinions on the sequel trilogy, but like I honestly think like what they did with Kylo Ren was like some of the worst storytelling I've ever seen. Because there's a conversation about having redemption in villains. We talk a lot about the concept of like redeemed in death and how that like sometimes works in stories and sometimes just feels really cheap, because like it's one thing to like do one good thing after a whole life of bad things and be like, peace out, like I'm done, I did my one good thing. Like it's a very,
I will give it to episode 6. I think that like Vader doing one
Yeah.
good thing and redeem, or like saving his son and then being redeemed in death is like, okay, fine, that story's not that complex anyway, so it makes a little more sense.
Yeah.
But I think when you get into the prequel or the sequel trilogy, it's like, okay, you're adding all these different layers, and like, yeah, I feel like, to sort of answer your question, what makes a good villain is I think you have to understand their motives, or at least you have to like have a curiosity about how they're unfolding in the story. And if like they just are not relatable at all, like if, you know, their motives just don't come from a place of hurt, which I think is where all of us can start to sympathize with villains and be like, okay, well, if I put myself in your shoes, I would also be really angry about that, or like I might, you know, I can see how that works. But yeah, I think good complex but like cogent motives is one of the things that I would say marks a good villain or a good character in general. But
yeah, I mean, that's a good point. I feel like in the case of like Kylo Ren, like it just sucks because it's like he started off by being, I would say, like maybe interesting. I again kind of one note in Force Awakens, but then like I mean, those movies are just kind of a train wreck, which is I think the sad part about it. So it's not even like that it was like, oh yeah, this one writer, like they really just like kind of got led astray and like, you know, they ended up making kind of a shitty character, but it was like those 3 movies are written and created by 3 completely different groups of people. And so like I think really what happened with him is that it's like a game of telephone, right? Like it just kind of keeps changing. Yeah. And with him, he ended up becoming a villain that was redeemed, but like in a way that I think felt unmotivated, or like, I don't know. Again, the narrative of those movies is really, really rough.
Well, it's like an initial trauma that made him, I guess, give into the dark side a little more, was feeling unwanted and literally attacked by Luke Skywalker.
Yeah, yeah. I was like, honestly, I don't know what he's.
Yeah, sorry.
That's okay. It's only been out for however long now at this point.
Like
but
for a long almost 10 years, maybe.
But I think that like, yeah, I think that was pretty well introduced in like in Force Awakens. But then I think as time went on, it got muddled, and I think they maybe tried to give him some different motivations that weren't as clear. And it's like, okay, I know he's struggling right now, but like, where are we going? You know.
Yeah. I feel like that's one of those, because he also, I mean, sorry, spoilers, he also ends up dying. And by dying, I mean, he gets kissed by a Rey and then disappears, which is probably, I've never laughed so hard. Sorry, those movies. But like, he is in a way supposed to be redeemed in death, I think, in the way that Darth Vader was. But like despite the fact that the original trilogy was like a very simple, we talk about this all the time, hero's journey narrative, where it's just, you know, it's archetypical stuff, right? It's just like there's
nothing really surprising about it.
Yeah, it's a hero and the princess and the bad guy and whatever. We have a scoundrel. But like the fun thing about Darth Vader is that he does, you know, the one good thing and then dies. And I think that like fit a simple narrative. But like in the case of something like, you know, the sequel trilogy, it gets so muddled, and then like Kylo Ren does like a good thing and then just kind of dies, and it feels like for no reason. Like he didn't become a better person. Like he kind of just like made decisions that didn't, I think, have a lot of consequence in the greater story. And so it just was, I don't know, it fell flat.
I think he struggled for too long before his redemption. And I think you probably lose the audience a little bit. I mean, I know people kind of go goo about him and how hot he is and whatnot, but like,
yeah, I don't know how much of that is Kylo and how much of that is Adam Driver. But,
Yeah, like,
right. I was
Ben
gonna say
Swallow.
there's gonna be some people listening to this
I'm
podcast
so
who are gonna be
sorry.
like, I'm turning it off right now.
I'm so sorry about that.
People, and I'm so sorry, and I'm not here to yuck your yum. You do whatever you want. I'm here simply to talk about narrative analysis.
Yeah, I've only ever seen each of those movies once, and not
same.
through the lens of any of this stuff. And one thing that I like differently take away from it, I would say, would be, I think in Adam Driver's acting, I think he does a really good job playing the character that he was given.
Absolutely.
Like, I believe everything that he goes through, and I think that makes a big difference in the person as well. Like, most of the stuff that we'll be talking about, actually everything that we'll be talking about in this season, is all animated, so the acting is not necessarily as big of a deal, I guess.
Yeah.
I guess like the actor who plays them does make a difference, but like in the case of a live action, like casting a person like Adam Driver, that's a very specific choice, and it was a good choice, because if it were anyone else, it would not have probably been what it was.
Yeah. I think he's a wonderful actor.
He's a phenomenal
I just think it's one of those things. It's like the Robert Pattinson of it all too, where it's like really great actor in a bad script, right?
Oh, yeah, it wasn't written well for him.
Exactly.
There was something you had said about, understanding villains' backgrounds and motivations can help us sometimes sympathize with them. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on kind of making that applicable to real life. Like, if there is a villain in our life, in our narrative, in our story, or just someone who's wronged us, and being able to understand their background and motivation, and like understanding that they may have gone through things, but they still hurt us, and like, how can we take kind of the way that we perceive villains on a screen or in a story that we like, but then also apply that to our real life, if that question made any sense at all.
No, it does. No, good question. It's a big one. I feel like it's important for it's hard. It's almost harder because the villains are like, they're fictional characters, right? So like, we can kind of project whatever onto them, and they're not gonna have anything to say about it. But it's one thing. It's also in real life to like realize, oh, okay, that person is also someone's mom or son or daughter or whatever, and like, they have their own life and their own backstory. It's still not like okay that they hurt me, but like, I think I can move past this and like, see them, for the hurt that they have, as well as the hurt that they're doing. But like, they might not have a positive character arc, right? Like, we almost don't have that 30-foot, what is it, 10,000 foot view. There we go. I got there eventually. Like we do with villains or characters that are fictional,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like, I we were talking about this earlier in the car, but me as a therapy goer, which is the only, experience I have potentially when it comes to this topic, is like, I think about like struggles in my life a lot through the lens of like a narrative. I think like it's easy to do that, especially like if
main
you're
character energy.
Yeah, well, and let me tell you, I'm never the main character in this. I mean, I guess I am. It's my own life, but like the concept of like, I think that can be like really helpful. I think it's been helpful to me in my life to be able to see that, and also like as a person who's grown up like reading things, watching things that are all about like, I guess like a hero's journey in a way. But I do think it gets a little dangerous, like when you start seeing things like in your own life as being locked into those really like archetypical relationships with each other. Like, I mean, fully admit this, like I've talked to my therapist about the idea that like it is easier, it's nice to see myself as an underdog in a story, because that means that like, despite the fact that forces are against you, it means that like you'll eventually prevail, right? And it'll be this like big, this like nice thing, right? And I think that's something that I use to like get through struggles in my life. It's like, well, you're the underdog, right? Like, but I think everyone likes to see themselves as the underdog, right? And like, it's easy then to see the person that maybe is like causing strife in your life as the villain, right? As an archetypical villain. And like, you guys are talking about Disney stuff, so like we could potentially transition to that too. But like the fact that like in those movies, it's like very easy to see that there's like good and bad. There's like a a villain, right? And a lot of times they're not necessarily super complex. And I think it's easy to like also apply that to your own life where it's like, you know, that person who's like bugging you is now like an archetypical villain and they are greedy and annoying and like all of these things. And me as the underdog is like the righteous one in this situation. So I think it's like it's easy to get into that and like as a motivation or even as like a coping mechanism and then just like forget that that person is also, you know, a human being with like thoughts and feelings and emotions and like stuff that they're living through. And like everyone is motivated. Sorry, everyone is motivated by stuff that's happened to them already, essentially. And like I think it's really important to like take a step back from like this kind of like crazy good versus evil battle that could be happening in your head to justify your own actions and be like, how is it though that like I'm having an effect on these people and like what's my part to play in this?
I
And,
might
like,
be the villain in someone's
yeah,
story.
I'm definitely the villain in someone else's story. Not gonna lie. It's easy to get there, you know, because I think at some point we start just being like so convinced of our own, you know, goodness in some of these things that it's hard to realize that like we could be bullying someone, you know. I think that's like a really typical, I don't know, conversation too, is like if someone is being bullied, like what's that bully going through? Like maybe they're
Who's
dealing
that
with
bully's
something.
bully?
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's always good to have that perspective or try to.
No, I really liked what you said about that. I hadn't ever really thought about that before. Obviously, also a therapy goer, you know, talking a lot about absolutes and trying to break out of that black and white thinking. But I never really thought about it in the same lens of like good versus evil and how, yeah, we are the main character in our story. And in all the stories that we consume, the main character is often typically usually the quote unquote good guy.
Yeah.
I also think that like it's like there are people in our lives who are evil, like they are just bad people, right? And sometimes we don't have control over that and they don't see themselves that way either, right? And something that I've noticed recently in like venting with friends or just conversations that I've been having is that sometimes people see when someone puts up a boundary as like them having bad behavior, right? It's like, I used to let you get away with this, and now I'm no longer letting you get away with this. I have now put up a boundary, or I've now decided that this is no longer okay. And because you are used to getting that from them, it feels like they are blocking you off. They're being the bad guy. But from their perspective, it's like, no, you've been taking, and I'm finally putting a boundary on it. And so like there are verse situations where like both people are the villain to the other person, right? And when I'm having these conversations with friends recently, because it's really big right now, it's coming up a lot in conversation, but like having radical empathy for why the person is behaving the way that they are, whether like knowing that it doesn't actually have anything to do with you, if it doesn't actually have anything to do with you, and that their behavior is their own bad behavior, right? And like I'm thinking this from the perspective of like a friend whose coworker is really like hammering them about, because they share hours, right? And they want to change the hours that they're working. And my friend is like, no, I'm happy with the hours that I'm working. I'm not willing to change them. And the other person is like, well, I don't like my hours, so something has to happen. And they're not getting anywhere because my friend is like, I've had these hours, set them myself, like that's the end of the story. I'm not changing them. And then the other person is like, well, I'm not getting what I want. And so it's very much like they're both being the villain in like, you know what I mean? Like they're both like, that's having that disagreement, like sort of makes it, like we keep talking about, a little more black and white, and like having radical empathy for both people and sort of being like, yeah, you shouldn't have to change your hours for another person if you don't want to. This is where a supervisor or someone ahead of you should, or like higher up than you, should get involved. And then the other person just sort of like pushing and pushing and pushing that boundary is like, obviously this person needs something, right? Like they wouldn't be behaving this way if they didn't need something. So that's another way of looking at it, is like sometimes there are just like really bad people out there, but sometimes it's just people who behave in a way that we don't want to have to deal with. You know?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, exactly.
Something, oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Something else you talked about when you were describing what makes a villain, that I really enjoyed, and that LB and I have talked about on this podcast many, many times before, is when they're not justified in death. And I think we could talk a little bit more about that, because I do think that especially in the Disney Pixar movies that we've been talking about, sometimes the characters are met with death, and it just seems like because this person was evil, the way that we get rid of them is by killing them. And also rewatching a lot of these movies like Snow White and like Princess and the Frog, where the character, where the person like the villain does die, it's very like dark, super dark. I'm like, these are kids movies. Okay, cool. But also,
and also
like,
what's the lesson we're teaching people?
Yeah,
like,
absolutely.
Exactly.
Bad people will just die if you wait long enough. Like, untrue.
Untrue. But also, it's like sometimes what is the most satisfying is when a villain gets a fate worse than death, which is like equal to the grievance that they caused on the world, you know?
Oh, absolutely. We love talking about fate worse than death.
It's a common topic.
Very, very common topic. Because again, I think like you really hit the nail on the head where it's like sometimes it's just unsatisfying. I think that's like kind of a lot of my beef, I guess, with like redeemed in death is like it's very like but the point is that you did so much horrible shit and now you just get to die. Like that's getting off easy, right?
You get to do one thing and then you're golden.
And then you're fine, right? But it's a lot harder to like live with your mistakes and choose to be a better person. On the Disney villains dying subject, I was thinking about this earlier. One of my favorite Disney movies is Tarzan. And the villain in that, and this is insane, it always has been insane to me, hangs himself at the end of the movie, like on accident, right? He's
because
like falling
of his
through.
own actions.
Yeah, because of his own
yeah.
actions. Where it's like, okay, I mean, that makes sense. Also, he's a terrible person, right? And but he's stuck in vines and slashing them and then just ends up hanging himself. And the fact that it's so grimly depicted too, because it's shadows on a wall and you just see him hang and go limp. And I'm like, this is insane for a children's movie.
Yes.
But and like I think in that it's like, I mean, like I guess I'm fine with him like eating it because it's like whatever. There are other circumstances though where it's like I just feel like a lot of times like having either a character flip right to like a different ideology is like a lot more satisfying. We were talking about Ratatouille earlier, and that the sort of the film critic, I will say, villain rather than the restaurant owner Skinner villain who doesn't really get redeemed. But the did I say film critic? Food critic.
It's a film if you think about it.
The food critic at the end, like we have this lovely scene at the end of that movie where he is remembering his childhood and he's like living this whole like story through like the experience of eating food, this particular food. And like then his whole thing that he writes is about like perspective. And we get this really interesting, I think, nuanced view of like, oh, like he was kind of a shitty person and was really just like doing the same thing and had his own story going on where he was like stuck in a rut and then like experienced this like joy through this one dish and was able to like, you know, I don't know, like have a better life because of it. And I think that was like, I don't know. I think that was like interesting and more complex and a little bit more nuanced than just like, I don't know, the villain dies in the end. And didn't he suck?
It feels so much more satisfying. Oh, I'm sorry.
I was gonna say it's also that is also redemption, right? So it's not it's like the opposite of fate worse than death. It's like this is like showing that this person is human and has emotions and is seeing other people for their human emotions as well too, which I think in Disney also a lot of the villains kind of are very selfish and self-centered and like we keep talking about like very black and white, like evil not evil, but that gives us a glimpse into some humanity, right?
It's like a positive, like, I mean, I haven't seen Ratatouille in a really long time, but like, you know, he kind of like learns his lesson. He wasn't like a villain in the sense that he did war crimes, but like he was sowing negativity into other people's lives and then therefore his own life. One big beef I have, I think one Disney movie that came to mind about fate worse than death or like what could have been better is Tangled. You're talking about how I think Mother Gothel trips and falls, right?
Yeah,
like
out of the tower. Also turns to dust. There's a lot of turning to dust.
She's old as hell.
Yeah.
But like I think it's a little more poetic in Tarzan, this like, you know, macho colonizing like man who's just there to conquer everything kind of in his own haste and like, I don't know, ungentlemanliness or ungentleness, like kills himself accidentally. I don't remember exactly what happens to Mother Gothel, but her just falling and dying, I feel like the fate worse than death for her, or the flip side of like we don't really ever get to see where she was coming from or why she was so obsessed with like living forever or having youth or beauty, other than like maybe projected ideas that we have onto her. But like her mending a relationship with Rapunzel or like you know, apologizing or like coming to a point where it's like, oh my God, like I'm so sorry, or like, you know, having some kind of like repairing a relationship, even though that's really not her mom and she gets to find out who her real parents are in the end. Like having that come full circle would have been like way more satisfying, I think.
And they kind of, I don't know if you've watched Tangled the series.
Not in a long time, and I apologize.
Tangled the series, I've watched like, I don't know, half of it maybe, some of it.
Yeah, they explore a little bit of like Mother Gothel's, I wouldn't say origin story so much, but like what she is doing right before she steals Rapunzel. And I have like mixed feelings about her death, because on one hand I agree with you guys. I think it is not fair that she just poof turns into dust, and oh no, okay, she doesn't have to deal with the consequences of how poorly she treated this person. But on the other hand, her whole thing was all about like vanity and wanting to live forever. Why? I don't know. But when Flynn / Eugene cuts Rapunzel's hair and it no longer has its magical properties, it's Pascal that trips her using the hair, and that's how she falls. And
I forgot it was Pascal. I was like, Rapunzel straight up kills her.
Yeah, shoves her out the window. But that's interesting too, because in that scene, Rapunzel is reaching for Mother Gothel to try and save her. And so there's like a lot of things to unpack as far as like, you know, still caring and possibly even loving for a parental figure that hurt you and abused you and blah 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 blah. But yeah, that one, I feel like I don't know, like I want to say I'm neutral toward it, but there's like mixed feelings as far as like, again, following the trope of just killing off your villains in the end, but then also like kind of layers of
I think it brought like that movie was what, 2010, I think.
Yes.
I think it brought like a new flavor to that like really typical Disney flair, right? Like I think there's a lot of Disney movies where the villain just gets killed. I do agree with you that like I think like having that whole scene really where like Rapunzel is reaching out and all of that stuff does a lot to color Rapunzel's character as like, you know, as being a really holistically like hopeful and good person. Like I don't think at any point in that movie we really see her being like worse than just like a really great sweet person. But I think that's like, it's a nice addition, I think, because like I think usually it's like we the audience know that those villains are villains, the characters already know those villains are villains, like there's not really any question about like whether or not they could be redeemed. And I think like having an action like that is like, I still believe that this person could do good, they could be redeemed, but like essentially like fate had other ideas for them.
Fate or an iguana. I'm sorry, he's a chameleon.
He is a chameleon. He could be an iguana, but
I mean also the fate could have been that she had to be an old woman and just not be
evaporated,
have magic. Like, you know, like she could have had to live as a haggard old woman until she died of like natural causes, which probably would have been worse for her because she did not want to live in that.
I'm trying to think through like what Disney villain had. I feel like I have such an idea of like what fate worse than death is outside of Disney movies, because I think we talk about it so much when it comes to like games and stuff. But like I'm trying to remember an example of like someone who didn't get killed and then had to like suffer consequences. Does Jafar get trapped in the genie lamp?
Yes.
So I guess that's kind of it. He has to serve that which I do think is actually a little bit more like fun and nuanced than just like killing him. There's just like a huge smattering of people who die in Disney movies, and like trying to remember which ones.
I was thinking of one where this character does die, but the fate is still worse than death, because it's in Coco, the Ernesto de la Cruz. He's already
in the afterlife.
Oh, that's okay. Don't worry about it.
No,
okay,
it's okay.
So
I don't worry about
spoilers. So Ernesto de la Cruz, big villain. It's a twist. Sorry, that's a spoiler. But like, he's obviously already dead, living in the afterlife. Find out that he does all these horrible things. When Coco goes back into the realm of the living, when Miguel goes back into we did this the whole episode too, by the way. When Miguel goes back into the realm of the living, Ernesto de la Cruz is forgotten, which is worse than dying, because when you are forgotten, you then sort of like evaporate into nothing. And the whole point of Dia de los Muertos is that you are remembered, right? And so Ernesto de la Cruz, for all of his life after death, was being remembered every Day of the Dead because he
His
had so many fans.
Yeah.
And then once the real news came out about the way that he literally murdered someone and how he stole his music from someone else, they started remembering the person that he stole the music from, and he got forgotten, which I think, like, even though technically he was already dead, I still think that counts as like a fate.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good thing to call out. And we were talking about this earlier. We have to watch Coco at some point.
Oh, I know.
I really like it.
Everything I hear about it, I'm just like, damn, that sounds like a great movie.
It's a really good movie. But like we are talking about this earlier, but like overall, I honestly kind of think that like Pixar has like a little bit more like depth of character in their movies versus like I think Disney is a little bit
Like
different.
Traditional Disney, yeah.
Exactly. Like I think they even in stuff like Encanto, which we did watch, and like I'm not a huge fan of that movie. I think they tried to do something a little bit more complex with it, but I don't necessarily think it like hit super good. But I much prefer, I think, like Pixar's way of doing things, because I think they just like add like stuff like that a little bit more to their stories, where it's like, I don't know, like just more complex in a way, even though it's like an all ages animation. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, this isn't specifically about a villain, but the first like 10 minutes of Up are some of the most heart-wrenching. Like I joke about this all the time, but I went to film school, right? And like every single time I had a class that was about like, you know, narrative storytelling, like even character design or set design or anything like that, we would watch the first 10 minutes of Up over and over and over again. I probably watched it like 10 times in college. And like every time I'm like weeping and I'm like, you guys have to stop making me watch this. But like it is one of the best scenes in probably an animated movie, right?
Yeah.
But like it's so like I feel like that's a really good way to see like there's a certain complexity to Pixar movies that I think is fun to talk about and is a little bit like flavored differently than a lot of like Disney movies.
Oh, absolutely. It's not so much good versus evil. Like I'm thinking of, Monsters Inc. and Monsters University. Yeah, there's an antagonist, but it's not really like them versus the bad guy. It's, I don't know, they have like their other thing going on, and the bad guy is just kind of like off in the distance doing his bad guy thing, and then they thwart him in the end. Yeah.
Although with Disney, we do have Wreck-It Ralph, which is a Disney movie. It's not Pixar, right?
That's true.
And so, and like Wreck-It Ralph is himself struggling with being a villain or being the bad guy, and kind of has to come to terms with like, yeah, I'm supposed to be this like big bad guy, but I still want to be friends with everybody. I still want people to like me, you know? And I think that's like very nuanced in and of itself as well too.
I think there's like some cool stuff. Like we are talking about that with Luca. I mean, this is another Pixar movie, but the fact that there's not really a villain in that movie. The villain is like society, right? It's like in Wreck-It Ralph. It's like, you know, the villain in that movie is, I mean, there is a villain in Wreck-It Ralph, but like the villain is kind of like the way that the society is built to like create heroes and villains.
It's like I think in Luca, it's I don't remember his name. It's Mr. Vespa, the snotty
the little
teenager.
mustache guy.
Oh
yeah.
The catfish
who is
mustache.
just constantly berating these children.
Yeah, insane.
It's like cool man. Like, you know, he totally represents the arm of like, or like the idealized like villainy of the bad thing of what society is like. What, you know, what the what is the word I'm looking for? The concept that the movie is diving into. Like they're the Plato's ideal of that concept.
Yeah, where it's like, I mean, showing the like in Luca, it's that like othering people. Like we don't like people who are different, right? In all of the many like definitions and context of that. Like, I don't know, I think it's interesting. Like I wanted Encanto to be so much better than it was, which is so I people love that movie. I just don't. But it's like I like the thought that that's about generational trauma, and you have similarly the grandma who's like kind of the one who's like essentially perpetuating that cycle. But like I feel like it just like as a movie lacked a lot of oomph. Like I liked what it was about. I wanted it to be more.
I think it comes down to like the reveals and how long they spend doing certain other things.
Yeah.
I feel like it was maybe a little bit too complex for the time that they had with it. Because I do like the idea. And when you were talking about earlier, you know, your example of the two people not wanting to share hours and like, you know, they each have a perspective, right? Like I think that's very strong in Encanto, where like, I mean, it's the generational trauma, but like, you know, the grandmother is like, you have to do this and this because this is how we do things. This is what keeps us safe. And like, you know, it's she's well intentioned. Like she's not a villain in that she just wants to see the world burn, but like, you know, she's not willing to see the perspective of her children and grandchildren about how she might be hurting them inadvertently, you know? So
yeah, I feel like I don't know. That movie is so complicated because it's like I think it's really interesting that we get like the grandmother's backstory and we like, learn more about her, which I think is obviously justified in that movie because they weren't trying to make a villain like a holistically like I want to see the world burn type of villain, obviously, because it's about family. But it's interesting that like I think it's a cool way to see like different perspectives. I wish I guess the movie was a little bit punchier. I don't know, like just something different there. I like the heart of it, just not the application. I suppose.
Yeah, I think it's the plot beats and
yeah.
things like that. I think Luca just blows the plot beats out of the water.
Yeah,
Like, they do that
God.
so well.
Luca is fantastic. Yeah,
I
so
cry every time.
underrated.
It is
is,
really.
actually.
I know. I guess my next question: why do we empathize with villains? Why do we root for some?
I love when we just both look at each other like, are you going to take this one or am I going to take it? That's a great question. Okay. So I think there's a series of cascading reasons that we could empathize with villains. I think there's intentional empathy where it's like in the case of Ratatouille and not the film critic, the food critic, where it is like put forward to us as viewers that you should empathize with this person. They become kind of good in a way or compelling or interesting because we have been like the narrative has been spun for us. I think there's an entire like other way where people really like villains or are compelled by them that they just really like what they're about, like their characters. Like there's something about them. It's very like a
I'm
fandom
thinking
spaces
about
thing.
I'm thinking of like Hades or Loki and
Yes.
yeah.
So oh my God, Hercules is like one of my favorite other Disney movies.
I was gonna say, talk about that.
Well, because I'm like like everyone or a lot of people our age, it was like a Greek mythology little fangirl for a very, very long time. Still am. But I love Hercules for a number of reasons. But I think Hades is such a cool villain because I think acting is a huge reason for it, actually, in this situation. Like, I can't even remember who the voice actor was, but like the intonations, the lines, the way that he's written is really like charismatic. I think charisma is something that you find a lot in villains, and usually it's like that silver-tongued, like kind of like essentially snake-like. In Disney, sometimes it's actually snakes. Type of character who's like very like using their charisma to like trick other people. I think what the cool thing about Hades is though is that like he's not like he's trying to schmooze and like do all this stuff, but like he's not, I don't know, like in that movie I think the like archetypes, really strict archetypes of these characters makes a lot of sense because it's this like Greek mythological tale, and like mythology is full of like archetypes. It pretty much is stories about virtues, right? And like being heroic or whatever. I feel like Hades is one of those people that like I think fans just really like him because he's got such a vibe about him. Like I think there's a whole category of villains that are like we love them for the vibe.
Yeah. Well, there's another question that I was going to ask later, but we can link it to this. Is like a lot of villains are queer coded, and that's why a lot of specific, I think that's why a lot of people like some of those villains as well, is because the vibe that they give, whether that be like like with Ursula being basically like literally based on a drag queen. Yeah. And I think Hades is another queer coded sort of villain, and Hook being a queer coded, like I think that there's a lot of villains who are seen as very popular and well liked, and it is because of the vibe that they put off. But is that vibe like okay, like that it's a queer coded villain or like a othered in some other way sort of villain,
I was gonna say, I think another reason that we maybe empathize with villains is we might see an echo of our own plights, and I think that is a common one in queer spaces of just feeling very like with Hades, very like I don't feel as good as the other people. I feel like an outsider. I feel I'm literally banished to hell, literally banished to the basement, like and that might be an attractive idea where like we might feel a sort of vengeance along with like this villain being like, you know what, they're right. Yeah, I think that's another reason. I mean, obviously I think we can use that could be a cathartic thing, I think, in a way to let go of some things or just like exercise some like I feel like I want vengeance, but instead of hurting the people in your real life, living out through this villain story, or saying, oh shit, I see a lot of myself in that villain, but they clearly caused a lot of harm. How do I have a positive arc rather than a negative arc and end up like that?
Yeah, and I feel like I mean, it's so interesting, the concept of like queer coded characters, because like obviously it's a conversation that's been going on for like literally forever, which is super interesting and great and fascinating. It's really interesting to then like go and analyze of like I mean, I guess like I sometimes feel this personally too, where it's like sometimes it's easier to like also see yourself as like the outcast or the villain because of the way that other people have treated you. So like, you know, seeing like exactly like seeing a villain and being like, I see how they're treated and I empathize because I know that from my own life experiences. And I think like honestly, then those characters become like a lot more like complex to the like to the person who's like feeling that. I mean, this is kind of a Bad Batch spoiler, but like that's a very crosshair mentality. Is like there's a character in that show who's kind of like a tertiary villain, but like a lot of people very early on were empathizing really hardcore with him. And it's like because I think there's something that like people see in that, right? Maybe in their own life experiences or just in what they like to see.
I was reminded, to bring it back to Disney, about Loki, especially in like I think like first Thor movie, where he is like, I don't know, we've kind of seen his transformation from like true, like he was a villain in the first Thor movie, to like now he's kind of an anti-hero or a hero. But like, you know, you get to see all of his like tragic backstory about how he was always like, you know, shunned in favor of his big brother, and like how he always felt, you know, horrible. And I think a lot of people can relate to that.
Yeah,
Similar family dynamics.
Yeah, and I feel like kind of just like especially when it comes to Loki, who's like such a fun, I don't know, like he's a trickster god, right? Like he's kind of like a very fun, like a vibrant character.
Also has a
like,
lot of charisma.
Absolutely, he does. He's got that riz. But the idea of like being the second child or the younger child and like being like, I'm never going to live up to my older sibling. And so what I do with that is become sort of like mischievous and kooky. Like I feel like it's kind of like jester energy that like is very like fun and common, where it's like what I'm going to do with that is I'm just going to be weird and fun and like kind of silly. And maybe do some like a little bit questionable
some
things,
light crimes.
you know, like I don't know. I think it is honestly in a way like I think a lot of the villains become a lot more complex when you start like thinking about it that way, especially like next to a hero who might just be a hero, right? Like they're just supposed to be heroic. They're just supposed to be like the shining knight, like, you know. So you get to have like I think a little bit more fun with villains sometimes like that too. And then they become more like I don't know, like true to form, relatable. Yeah.
No, that's a really good point. I hadn't ever really thought about that, especially because like we've been talking about Disney villains. It's very obvious, like good guy versus bad guy. But in I guess I could say more modern media, we do get a little bit more complicated villains. Or speaking about Crosshair, you know, his whole thing is that he just makes a lot of mistakes, but you're still rooting for him to change. You know, I'm thinking of Zuko from Avatar: The Last Airbender.
Yes, absolutely.
I think it's easy to root for the hero sometimes when the villain is just like really, really bad. But when they start to become relatable as like, oh, they've just made a lot of mistakes in life and they've never had the nurturing guiding hand to set them back on the right path. So then like sometimes we as the audience are like, we can change him.
Yeah, exactly. It's that mentality, which is like the best. Yeah, I feel like that like perspective is so interesting. We were chatting earlier about Moana, which is another movie I really like, where like I think the villain in that becomes a little bit more interesting and complex. Like I liked the take on that a lot, where like it's Teka, but she's not, right? Like and she actually has just like been changed. And like when you start to see like, oh, it's Maui who stole her heart from her, and then he sort of becomes like the villain in this story. But I don't know. I like that it wasn't like the end of that movie, the act 3 of that movie is like, oh, I have to take on Teka, like, oh, and I'm failing over and over again. It's like because you have to like take a step back and change your perspective and realize that like, you know, you are seeing this entity as like a villain because of like potentially the way they look or the stories that you've told, but really like it's the same person all along. Like I really liked how nuanced that was, and like kind of in a I don't know, not in like a baby way, not in like a demeaning way, but like in like a simplified down, but still kind of like nuanced version.
We talk about this a lot too, where like sometimes simpler is better.
Yeah.
I have a question for y'all that will take it like way back. Do you remember having a favorite villain growing up, and perhaps why?
Just in anything?
Like yeah, you can. I technically wrote Disney villain, but I opened it up for anything if you would like to, you know.
I was not a huge Disney kid, but one of my, and it still remains to this day, one of my comfort movies is the original Peter Pan, which like we just watched that again like a couple weeks ago, and I was just like, damn, the racism and misogyny is heavy in this.
It's like, ooh,
Yikes.
ooh, this is a movie from the 1950s.
Yeah, exactly. But I guess I wouldn't say that Captain Hook is my favorite villain in the fact that like, oh, I really like him as a person, but
Sure.
like I think he makes the story really interesting, and I think he's the same voice actor that voices Wendy and the boy's father. And in the beginning of the movie, when their mother and father are getting ready to leave for their party, he's just very obviously like he comes in and interrupts the boys, you know, play fighting, and you know, his cummerbund or bib or whatever it is that he needs to find is like their plaything, and he rips it out of their hands, and you know, and then he tells them they all have to grow up, right? And then this amazing adventure happens where, you know, the villain is this adult person. I mean, you want to talk about perspectives, try thinking about being terrorized by a 12-year-old boy for all of eternity, and I could totally understand Captain Hook. But I felt like that in a simple way kind of illustrated like this fear of like, oh, I don't want to be that when I grow up, so I just will never grow up. And so he's also very kooky and fun, and like, you know, so I would say that from the Disney slate, I think he's one of my favorites.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, like I mentioned, I love Hercules and Tarzan. Like I loved Hades. I love Hades. I think that character is amazing. I feel like it's so hard to be like reach back into my brain and be like, what was very early on. To be fair, and this is not Disney, but I think we probably both like him a lot. Zuko is like, I think, one of my favorite, I guess, villains, very redeemed villain, obviously. And I don't know, I watched Avatar, like probably in middle school. But the fact that I feel like I viscerally hated him in the first season, right? And then like started showing signs of maybe flipping, and I was just like, I'm suspicious of you, but okay. And then he flips, and I'm just like, oh my God, he's such a great character. I was just like, even like at 11, I was like, I think he's great. But I don't know, like I think that's so cool. I don't know. It's so hard. There's so many good villains.
There are.
I'm
trying to
think
of other Disney. I'm trying to think of like off the beaten path Disney villains. I can't even remember any. It's like, what Disney movies did I watch as a kid? We watched Oliver and Company a lot for some reason.
Oh,
that's a scary movie.
I really do like Maleficent too. I think she's quite interesting.
There you go, dragon.
Yeah, I mean, she can turn into a dragon, so that's cool as hell.
Number one, pretty cool.
Her color palette, amazing.
Perfection. Yeah.
She's another one
I
of my
agree
favorites.
completely.
I don't even remember. I guess Yzma. We can do a 2000
Yzma.
Yeah. Shout out. I love 2000s Disney movies.
I can't wait for us to discuss her. We are doing her later.
She's
this
amazing.
She's great.
So that's gonna be so fun. That's gonna
she's
be so
another
fun.
one of those villains where she's like not a good villain. Like she's really bad at being bad.
Yeah.
But you're still rooting for her.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know. I think that movie, it just needs more love, I think, than it gets. Like,
oh, absolutely.
I remember, I think it was like a couple years ago, maybe last year, one of my coworkers was doing like a Disney movie rewatch. And like a lot of my coworkers are a little bit older than me, so they kind of missed the 2000s era of Disney movies. And he was like, man, Emperor's New Groove is so good. I was like, yeah, have you never seen that movie before? It's so good. Like, it's hilarious, great characters. I love it.
Yeah, I feel like what's charming about her is that, like what you said, she's very bad at being bad, which kind of makes her charming, but also she's like just this side of kind of a buffoon that you're like, you can't, and then there's the charm of because you're like, okay, I want him to become good, right?
Yeah. I like that movie is like a series of A, villains, and B, buffoons. Like Cusco is also kind of a villain.
He sucks too.
Yeah, he sucks. He's kind of an idiot.
Kind of the hero in all of that.
Yeah, and then like Kronk, who's a henchman, and is like kind of stupid but kind of sweet. Like I really like that movie is kind of like everyone sucks a little bit, you know?
Yeah. Do you care, LB, if I start going through the list that we have of what makes a villain, and then kind of anyone can interject as we go through it?
Go for it.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I kind of consolidated this list in my own research before this podcast episode on what makes a villain. So I'm going to read from it. Feel free to interject as I go through, or if you want to wait until the end, you don't have to. But I feel like LB might have things to say because we've already talked about a lot of characters and villains. So in general, in this list of what makes a villain, number one is their motivation and why, which we talked about a lot in this episode very clearly. It must be believable, and also they must believe they are doing the right thing, or like what works for them, right? Like, and that's on perspective, which we also talked about. Number two is their backstory and depth, which we also touched on, and that is their tragedy. What happened to them? How were they treated? How did society treat them? How did their peers treat them? How did their family treat them? Da 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 da. Can we empathize with them in some way? Which again, we've talked about a lot in this episode. And I just added, because you just said it, but I added charm there as well. Like, what is it about them that is enticing, right? Number three is that they have their own morality, which we kind of haven't talked about a bunch. So if you guys want to chime in here, but they have explicit reasons that drive their actions. They fully believe that their actions are justified, even if it doesn't seem that way to the hero. They are the hero of their own story, and their own morals are clear. So it's explicitly clear, like, their morality. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I feel like from the hero's perspective, it's diluted by their own like morality, but like from an outside perspective, is they just have their own ideas of morality. We were talking about this earlier with like a certain video game character who we don't have to talk about. It's kind of, I don't want to spoil anything, but the idea that like people, like a villain can be a villain not because they've necessarily done horrible things, like maybe they have, but the fact that they could be so convinced of their own maybe messed up morality that they're like making crazy choices. Like, I don't know, I kind of like that idea of like, it is really at the end of the day, it's like motivation and like what you believe in, and if you believe in something that ends up hurting people, like you kind of end up becoming the villain. I don't know.
And I think also the means that they take to get to where they want to go, like not just the why but also the how.
Yeah.
No, it's hard. It's I know what you're talking about, but there's new Dragon Age game coming out soon, which we're all very excited for. But yeah, I know it's hard without spoilers. What came to mind when you were talking about villains having like clear motivations, or like the reasons that they take certain actions. I was thinking about when we were talking about Morgan Elspeth.
Yes.
This character from Star Wars, which I guess is technically Disney. But she's in like what, like 3 shows now. She's in The Mandalorian, she's in Ahsoka, and she's in Tales of the Empire, which is the animated one. But like we talked about this in our Tales of the Empire episode, where a lot of her, like I was really excited for her to be like a very good villain and a really relatable villain, because like the beginning of her story is that her culture just kind of gets wiped out by what would later become the Imperial forces. And I'm like, okay, that's a really great foundation for like, because I think that's a completely understandable thing of like, I just want to I want to reclaim my culture. I want to get revenge on the people who did this. But the way that they wrote her into these other people's stories is so, like, it is very unclear how the actions she's taking are going to help her get there, or like that she even wants to get there again. And it really bummed me out, because I'm like, it was so good. You started like with such a good motivation, but kind of really fumbled it.
Yeah. She's another one who like the redeemed in death, or like getting
She's
what
not
she
even
wants. Like she doesn't like her story gets really like, I think we had a lot of ideas of what it should be, and it ended up not being any of them. And like
it just takes such a backseat to like everything else.
Yeah, I think she becomes like, and I think that's like why I get kind of sad when we talk about like shitty stories, is because I'm like, there's so much potential there to make a really interesting character that maybe people could relate to, or find some interesting like new knowledge by seeing their stories. And like in the case of Morgan, she just kind of like gets what she wants and then dies.
Well, she kind of just like starts doing shitty stuff, but like I'm like, it's not clear. Like, you kind of just turned into a bad person.
Yeah.
I don't see the connection between wanting to restore what you lost and then like doing all these other extraneous things that aren't going to help you get there, really. Like becoming the evil governor of a town and, you know, union busting.
Yeah. Yeah.
How was that helping you get there, you know?
Yeah, it is a very like, I think it's pretty easy to tell too. And it's hard with a lot of these like streaming shows now, and I think especially Star Wars suffers a lot from like, we just want to put our characters in everything now, so like it feels really interconnected. I know Marvel kind of is suffering from that a lot too, but like I feel like it's really easy when you write these stories that you're just like inserting characters that you just have in your back pocket into to like kind of mess up their motivations. And then, yeah, like you could have had a really cool villain. And then what you had instead was just kind of like a woman doing things that a little suck.
Which
like,
also really weakens your hero.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like, I mean, we have, I guess, mentioned that, but not yet to talk about it, where it's like the existence of characters is to create foils, right? Create like perspectives and like color the hero or the villain depending on like what side you're on, right? Like they exist to be next to each other and like, you know, to analyze across from each other. And I feel like you kind of weaken your story when you don't maybe have the correct motivations for a villain, right? Then your hero becomes
not even correct, but like clear.
Yeah.
Why does this person want this?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
No, it's amazing you brought that up. That's the next point. The next point has many of the same characteristics as the hero, but they're misdirected in a way that mirrors the hero in some way.
I think that's honestly like, and we talk about this extensively.
I was going to say, I feel like you guys talk about this specifically in the Tales of the Jedi episode with Dooku versus Ahsoka, and I loved the way you guys broke that
thank
down.
you.
I think we just like one day learned what character foils were, and we're like, that's my favorite literary device.
Blew our minds. Like, so I mean, and I guess briefly explaining like how I understand character foils is like essentially two characters that are mirrors to each other, or in my brain they kind of like spiral into each other, so they're like the reverses. They're the same but in reverse, right? And you're able to see a perspective maybe in each other that you wouldn't be able to see if you didn't have that character. And I feel like, I mean, I think that's like the point of a hero and a villain. Like if we're really like gonna get into the big broad strokes like narrative analysis stuff, is like they exist together, right? Like that's the point. I'm so
it's
sorry.
So hard for you to not talk about it.
I'm so sorry. I'm gonna talk about Batman briefly.
With Julia, all roads lead to Batman.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. It's like my single huge obsession. By single, I mean I like that you knew where I was gonna go with that. But like, I mean, it's Batman and the Joker, right? Like they exist together. They are a unit. Like there is not one without the other. And I think that's honestly a really cool thing to bring into your story. You can make it a super big idea. Like I think Acolyte actually did that kind of interestingly, where like light and dark exist because of each other. It's not necessarily like bad stuff happened one day, you know? It was like there is a balance, right? And I think like characters, both good and bad, have this like really interesting reflexive like look on each other.
Well, I think especially with Batman and the Joker, and so sorry it's not Disney, but
maybe one day eventually.
They're both so intense, and if you divorce like their characters from like the media that they're in, it's a weird ass thing to be doing. Either dressing up like a clown and terrorizing people, or dressing up like a giant bat and helping people. Like it's crazy, right? But they're both that like equal,
AKA the movie The Joker.
yeah, basically. But they're that equal but opposite spectrum of like intense, right? But they're representative of different things. Batman is order, Joker is chaos, more or less. But you can get more nuanced about it. But
but I think like
so that's a really good example of a foil.
Yeah, exactly. Like I think it's cool to bring a sort of like big like heroic mythological like aspect to things in that way too, where it's like we only exist because we exist together, even though we're like on opposite sides of the same coin essentially. But I think it's like a really strong thing you can do with your narrative, like when you're starting from your building blocks of a story is like, okay, like what does my hero stand for, and like what does my villain represent, and
how do I give my hero the absolute like worst thing that could possibly happen to them, or like the person that is like the stumbling block in every feasible way with them. Like that makes the hero overcoming things like way more.
Yeah, you're using them to, I mean, it's like narrative is created, right? So like you're creating the stumbling blocks for your hero that ultimately they can triumph through. Like it's just, and we keep going on about this. I feel like this is like our favorite thing to talk about is character foils, but like I do really think that like it makes a better story for you to experience, and also like it literarily like makes it a stronger experience.
I'm glad you're talking about this. I mean, the whole point of this episode is like, what makes a villain, what makes a good villain. And it's funny though, like when you were talking about that, I was thinking about Megamind and how
my God,
movie,
yes. We love
I love
the
Megamind.
quote unquote hero, disappears, and he's like, he's the villain, but he's like, who am I without this other person? We've been going at it for so long, and so you know, spoilers to anyone who hasn't seen Megamind, but then he goes on this whole thing about trying to create a hero to battle it out, and then he ends up becoming the superhero because the hero he tries to create is a villain, and blah 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 blah. But anyway, yeah, I think that's
is
really
like
interesting.
a piece of art. It's a piece of
It's
fine
so
art to me.
good.
It's so good.
I was literally gonna bring it up earlier, and I was like, I don't know. It's not a Disney movie. No, it's DreamWorks
Okay,
movie.
okay, sorry.
It's same era. It's like, I mean, we were talking about this earlier, but it's like Spirit, Prince of Egypt, Megamind are all like the DreamWorks animation slate of the sort of 2000s. They're really great movies.
How to Train Your Dragon.
Oh my god, I love that movie.
So good.
We'll
Anyway.
talk about DreamWorks one day. Yeah.
Yeah, have us back.
Yeah.
Yes, of course.
Okay. So I have a couple more points to hit with you. One of them to hit you with, not hit with you, whatever. So one of the points is that the villain is proactive, and to, even though listeners, you have not heard our Wish episode yet, we already recorded it, and LB and I are not huge fans of Magnifico, and I think this is the reason why, because he's more reactive rather than proactive. And what does that mean? It means that the villain will work tirelessly and mercilessly to achieve whatever they want, rather than sitting around and waiting or reacting to the events that happen around them. Villains start the story with a surprising amount of control, such as corrupt governments or a bully or, you know, something like that, but they are obsessed with maintaining or increasing that control or their goal. And then they are actively making life harder for your would-be heroes, even if they don't know it. Like, even if they're not aware of the hero, like they're on their own sort of mission. So that's the proactive point.
Yeah. I mean, I think we didn't like King Magnifico for a lot of reasons. This is definitely one of them, but, and spoilers for our episode, but motivation is not clear. Backstory
It's a big
clear.
bummer, isn't it, when it's not
It's
clear?
a huge bummer. Yeah.
I feel like it just always is like, especially with Disney stuff, I think a lot of times as viewers, we just have like we have an idea of what the movies are going to be. So like when it ends up not being like that, it just kind of sucks. I will say, and I saw this open on Becca's phone. So I'm just Googling Disney movies now. But a really great villain that we have yet to talk about is Scar. I love Scar.
Yeah.
The fact that he is so clearly motivated to the point where there's something in animated movies called an I want song, which is usually when the female protagonist is like, this is what I want for my life. You know, it's just around the river bend in Pocahontas. But I love that Scar gets his own I want song. Like, usually there is
the best in Disney.
Literally,
the best villain song
and this
ever.
is another one of those, like, acting made a huge difference. Jeremy Irons is Scar. And yes, he is phenomenal. He's incredible. And I think this is a huge reason why the live action version was so bad. Yeah. For a number of reasons. Like, you can't beat 2D animated, but also like you just didn't have the performance behind it. And like, I love that he has an entire song about his like new regime essentially, and how he's like, I've been working very actively hard at this. I killed my brother. It was a whole thing. I also killed my
You were
nephew.
there.
Also a whole thing. But, you know, I've got great plans. And like to the point where he's promising like the hyenas, right, that they're going to have like a better life. They're never going to have to like fight over food again, right? Like, I think he's such a clearly motivated villain who's got that charisma too. Like, he's such a charmer. And I don't know, like, he's such a great villain for a movie about animated lions. Who knew, you know?
Yeah.
We don't talk about this that much because a lot of the things that we talk about do have like a clear, like, you know, person as a villain. But on your point about villains being proactive rather than reactive, I think there's like, I came across a list a while ago of like different things that could cause conflict between like your hero and what they want in a story. And one of those was like, you can kind of be fighting against like a force of nature almost, where like it's kind of just a wall, right? And like that's not necessarily like a villain, but it is kind of your source of conflict. And I think it is such a bummer when characters who were created to be like human beings or like have that empathy become more of the stand-in force of nature rather than a person with complex, you know, needs, wants, motivations. And, you know, it's kind of like infantilizing a little bit because it's almost like your heroes then become like kids that are kind of just up against like an obstinate parent, you know, rather than like, oh, this person, you know, has clearly has like motivations and they're working towards those rather than just like reacting to everything our hero does.
honestly, I just thought about this too, where it's like, I feel like a good way to put it too is like, I think what makes a good villain is like conceivably being able to see like that they have their own story separate from our general narrative. Like, if you can understand enough about that character to be like, honestly, I'm interested by whatever their like the reverse movie of, you know, Lion King that's all about Scar, you know, like I think you can make a really good villain if you are setting up that character in a way that like we're asking for more, right? Where we could see that there could be more. Like, I think that's a really delicate balance, right? Especially when it comes to like Disney villains, which again are very like black and white archetypical. We need them to be villains because we need our audience to know that there's a bad guy that we can fight. But like being able to like intrigue audiences like a little bit more, I think is like what makes those characters like really fun and engaging.
Yeah, that's like an interesting parallel or two sides of the same coin of like as far as wanting backstory. I think sometimes we want more backstory because we love a character and we're like, oh my gosh, give me more, tell me more. And then also like, I don't understand this character at all, tell me more, give me more so that I can better understand why they are the way they are. Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah. I think a villain that they did really well, like that got that right, was Cruella. We didn't need to know why Cruella wanted to kill all those puppies, but we knew that she did, and she was bad for it, you know. And it's like, and of course I would love to know more. I want an I want song from Cruella, right? Like, give me that. She's one of my favorite villains. But then when they did the movie, which we'll talk about in our Cruella episode, it was very much like an origin story, which was also very interesting, but not what you would expect for what the setup of 101 Dalmatians is, right? But I think that yeah. But anyway, moving on, 2 more points left to go through. One of them is they have power, whether that is physical strength, intelligent, political pull, magical abilities, social or societal pull, lots of money, or anything that will allow them to do something that others usually can't. So that's, and then the last one is that they are designed well. They have a quality design, and that they have an intimidation factor, a badass factor, and that they don't fall into stereotypes. And the reason I put the doesn't fall into stereotypes ones is because I do think that some villains, like I mentioned earlier, they're a little bit queer coded, or they are othered in some other way, like they have large noses, or they are fat, or that kind of thing. So that's why I added that in there.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's a great thing to call out. And I do think, like, I mean, we've briefly mentioned like Disney is not perfect. I mean, it's a studio that's been around for a very long time. And I think even like in more recent times have suffered from like, I get like stereotypical, like falling into that idea. And I think like I love the movie Princess and the Frog, but I think it still like kind of has issues with that when it comes to like Dr. Facilier being like essentially like a voodoo witch doctor and like maybe playing into stereotypes with that. That's like a really important thing I think to talk about. But I do think like it is interesting to bring up in general the idea of like art being a really important factor in that as well. I mean, briefly, it's always good when mentioning art to say that like as an artist, we have responsibilities for the art that we create. You know, it's an ongoing conversation, but like, you know, if you make something that has a negative effect on people or is unfairly representative of a people group, that is your responsibility. And I hope that like obviously going forward, everyone, including filmmakers, like understands the gravity of that.
When you know better, you do better.
Exactly. Yeah. And again, obviously Disney is made of people and therefore not perfect. But I do think it's like a great conversation to have that like, because animation is such a unique art form, like it has a way of creating a story that like live action doesn't. It's like why I'm a huge fan of animation. You can do a lot more than you can really in live action, even with like CG, right? And I think we can see that in these like live action remakes of Disney movies, right? Where like Lion King is supposed to be like photorealistic lions, but like they can't emote in the way that like 2D animated hand drawn stuff does, right? And I think you lose on a lot of the experience of the story, right? Like Scar is never going to be a compelling villain in that aesthetic because it's just not like human enough, essentially. Like we can't see ourselves in it. But yeah, I think like design is like a really great concept to talk about with that. Like again, I think Hades and like Hercules in general is like such a well-designed movie, and I think it creates a really interesting like villain in the way that like we see Hades, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. For anyone who wasn't watching the video, as soon as Heather mentioned art, Becca looks over at Julia. And for context, Julia, you are an art major, you are a graphic designer, you are all about art. And I just thought that was really funny.
We have our little Julia's design corner on our podcast.
I'm far from an expert, but I did go to school for design and animation, so that's kind of like my special little like thing I love to talk about. And like I'm a very big proponent of like whenever this happens all the time during like the Oscars and stuff, where like the animation award comes up and then there's people who are like, animation, our kids love it, you know, and like like put down animation as an art form. And I think like, I mean, anyone who's watched anything outside of Western animation will know that like it's like anything like from Studio Ghibli or like French animation is crazy. Like it's such a unique environment to create and tell stories. And I think like a lot of the ways you can do that is visually, because you're not constrained by real life, right? Like you can have Hades who has hair fire and it like emotes with him, right? And like changes color and goes out and he's like annoyed by that. Like I think there's just like the bounds of reality are not there, right? So you can do a lot more. And I think like you can tell stories, in my opinion, a lot of times better than you can in live action. So
yeah, like the visuals and cinematography that, you know, again, my brain just keeps going back to Zuko because he's one of my favorite quote unquote villains, redemption arcs, whatever. Is just like whenever they talk about his past, it's always his non-burnt side. Or like whenever they're talking about his honor, him being the prince of the Fire Nation, and then when they're talking about his goodness and his path toward joining the Avatar or whatever, it's always his scarred side, you know, and just like the split. Anyway, big fan of that. And actually I have to thank you guys for your podcast and what you guys talk about it on it, because it wasn't really until watching or listening to your guys' podcast that I started noticing these things in animation and in film, and just when I'm watching things and I'm like, oh yeah, the clouds look really cool and the lighting and the amazing. And the show that comes to mind specifically about that was Arcane. I think I was watching Arcane around the time you guys started sharing your podcast, and I was like, colors are amazing.
I adore Arcane for that reason. Like I love, and they have a lot of those like overlaid 2D animation moments like during like fight scenes and stuff. They're really cool. And like again, like unique eye-catching stuff in your shows like help support your narrative. I talk about this all the time, but this is a quote from like, I don't know, some old school Disney guy who I can't remember the name of right now. I'm so sorry. But it's this quote where it's like, it's not just a good story, it's a good story well told. So it's not just that you've written a compelling villain, it's the fact that you are representing them in a way that is also compelling, equally compelling, if not more, right? So it's like everything in that story, you know, your writing, your visuals, your music, all of that is creating something that is well told.
That's why animation can be so good, because it's like everything is controlled. There's not as much like human factors of actors forgetting their lines or like, you know, certain set pieces not being quite right. Like if you have the time, like things can be, you can get just like almost to perfect, right? So it's really cool, and it's such a shame that a lot of people just think of animation as just like, oh, that's for kids, because it's like Arcane has such a cool style that like I'm like I mean, how can you look at this and not be like, it's art? You know?
Yeah, and it's definitely not for children.
No. Yeah, for sure.
Well, and we talk about so much on this podcast how even stuff that is marketed towards children is not just for children. Like
we talk about that all the time in regards to Bad Batch, because it is like it's an all audience show, but it's not geared towards like younger people. Like it is geared towards just like the greater audience in general, where like there are some really complicated episodes and complicated like motivations and situations that they get into, and it's just like, wow, it's really refreshing to see.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's cool to discuss, and like we discuss this so much in our first season of Bad Batch, because there's a particular term they throw around a lot.
Cost prohibitive,
which is like not a word I
like
knew.
An 8-year-old isn't gonna know what that means.
No.
But like they aren't like, oh well, an 8-year-old's not gonna know what that means, so we have to say like that's too expensive, that costs that much money. Like they just roll with it. It's like context. We'll cover
cool it in my mind that like a lot of these things, like while they are all ages animation, can either like is a huge broad spectrum. I mean, that's something that's for adults and also for 8-year-olds, right? Like I really enjoy that animation has the power to do that, and that like again, something like Bad Batch is rated, I don't even know, not a high TV rating, like it's like rated G or something, right?
Probably.
Yeah, like I don't know,
Like
it's got
Y7 or something.
yeah, it's got like, some animated violence in it, but it's like not, super, like it's not even like probably PG-13, right? But it's like we can all have a good time watching this and we can all learn things about characters and we can all be compelled by this story, right? And it's not like locked behind an age gate, essentially. Like I think that's like such a cool power of animation to talk to way more people, like than just a movie that seems very like grown up, I suppose.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and that's what like HB and I going through all of these Disney princess movies and then talking about Pixar in our last season. It was, and we've said this in multiple episodes, but it was always really interesting where we would have two very, very different perspectives of like Heather watched it as a kid, watched it again for the first time as an adult. I've been watching these on repeat since I was a child, and then also like gleaning new and different information and takeaways that you just don't pick up as a child because you don't have the perspective or experience to like be like, oh, this is generational trauma, this is perfectionism, this is anxiety. I agree.
I had a little bit of a realization like that with we were watching Peter Pan.
Yeah, no, I was literally about to talk
funny
about this.
But like, so the crocodile that's like constantly haunting Captain Hook, and maybe this is just me not realizing this earlier, but like the tick-tock is like being combined with that, like the crocodile has eaten that clock is like, oh, that's his impending death. Like he's scared of aging. He's scared of like time. Going further in time. Yeah. I was just like, wow, that's wild. Aren't we all scared of time? Isn't that crazy?
Yeah. I feel like when we watched Peter Pan, I mean, we've watched it a couple of times, like somewhat recently. Like I completely different than when I was a child. I was like, fun movie. Isn't Peter Pan so fun? I was like a big
fuck that adult.
Yeah, fuck that adult. I was a big Tinkerbell fan as like a kid. Like she was like my absolute favorite. I was like, I love that she's got so much attitude. Good for her. And like I still think that. But like it's so funny to me to be like, wow, if I was haunted by a 12-year-old for my whole life, I would
also be evil.
I would be horrible. Like I think like it really is just like fun to go back and watch these things that were like so influential on us as children and be like, I have a very different understanding now.
Yeah.
And it's
also
funny,
Peter Pan is an asshole, so
oh my god, yeah.
Oh my god, he's so annoying.
Like we were watching and it was like, I actually kind of feel bad for Captain Hook. I think again, it's just like because I'm not 12 anymore, right? And like when I was 12, I was like, yeah, fuck that guy, he sucks. And now I'm just like, I cannot even imagine.
Specifically at 12, you are thinking, fuck this guy. I love that.
Yeah. That was my vocabulary as a 12-year-old is fuck this guy, he sucks. Anyway, me and my 8 friends are gonna go hang out in a tree now.
Oh my gosh, I've absolutely loved the conversation that we've been having. Is there anything else that you, either LB or our guests, would like to bring up before we wrap up this evening?
I think everyone has said their favorite villains, but I have yet to say mine, and I'm just going to throw it out there. It's probably none that we're going to be talking about this season. I love Dr. Doofenshmirtz.
Oh my god! Yes. I had a brief moment when we were chatting where I was like, what about him though?
Yeah, he's, for context, HB, he's from a show called Phineas and Ferb, which I think was way after your time. And he fights a platypus named Perry the Platypus, who's a secret agent. Secret agent. And he's just he's very much like Yzma. He's just really bad at being bad. And his motives, he's a silly, goofy, fun character. His motives don't really make any sense. And like the things he does also doesn't make sense. He has money somehow, ? I don't know. But anyway, he's just funny. He's one of those people that you love and you're rooting for, even though he's technically the bad guy.
I adore the fact that like his motive is to like take control of the tri-state area. Like he's very measured. He's like, no, I know what I'm capable of.
It's not the world.
It's not the world. It's not even the United States. Yeah. It's just the tri-state area.
And I think I love about him is that like as time goes on, we get like little tiny bits of more backstory with him where then you kind of just like feel sorry for him. Like he has like a daughter who doesn't want to talk to him. He thinks he's lame. And like I think an ex-wife or something. I don't know. Like Charlene. He's just got like
his parents weren't there at his birth. He was raised by ocelots. He's been through
a lot. It's just so good. Like I guess we didn't really touch on this, but like there is like an avenue in storytelling where you don't necessarily want your villain to be maybe not super compelling or like really like, I don't want people to empathize with this guy. I want them to just like, it's okay if they're a little one-dimensional, like there's a purpose in that. And
there
I
are a
feel like,
few times where it's necessary to have a villain that's just like, this guy's just straight up evil. There's
yeah, it
something
just sucks.
good about him, but not often.
But I think it's so funny that Phineas and Ferb was a show that ran for like so long, and for so long it was just like, I don't know, this guy, he's just kind of goofy and he's bad at his job and he's evil, I guess. And then, you know, time goes on, he kind of becomes, I feel like, a fan favorite character, and we get
Absolutely.
like
Yeah.
more backstory, which I think is so funny.
Yeah, it's great. That's all my notes. Anything else before we kind of wrap up and let you guys talk about where folks can find you online?
I don't have any extra thoughts, but
I think that's it for me.
but thanks so much for having us on.
Yeah,
It was super fun.
Yeah.
Thank
you so
you,
much
yeah.
for being here. This was so fun. Loved all of this. You guys are hilarious and great. So
You can find our podcast, which is called, again, The Good, the Bad, and the Batch, pretty much anywhere you can find podcasts, but mostly Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And you can also follow us on Instagram and Tumblr at The Batch Pod.
And now I'm like, do I do my outro portion that I always do? Do you want to do the outro? I can kind of.
All right.
So if you like story
And you like Star Wars.
then tune in to an episode of The Good, the Bad, and the Batch.
And don't forget to catch Mental Health Multiverse.
Yeah, absolutely.
thanks, guys. Should we try to
Thank
do
you,
it?
yeah.
Should we try to do a synchronized bye? I feel like we have to.
What
try.
would we say?
We just say bye. We can do it. I believe in us. HB, are you ready? Are you down? Okay.
Mhm.
Ready? 1, 2, 3.
Bye.
Bye.